From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Meche breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
We're a week away from the NFL draft, and it's been pretty exciting so far to see how everything has fallen when it comes to free agency, all the rumors, all the lying so far. It's been interesting to see what has happened so far, but now that we're just a week away from the NFL draft, I've done plenty of mock drafts on our website, ESPN Southwest Louisiana.com. But one of those teams that is picking in the first round, of course, the New Orleans Saints. We cover that here on our station, as well as plenty of other guys around the area. That's where they cover as well. I want to get more insight specifically to the black and gold, and who better to go to than the host of the Locked On Saints podcast, Ross Jackson, joins me. Ross, how are you doing?
Doing great, man. Glad to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Oh yeah. Appreciate you coming on for the first time. I want to start before we get into the draft. I want to look more at what has happened so far in free agency because we know with the Saints, for the most part, they usually don't go for the big splash names for the most part. It's more of under the radar guys that they can get on cheap-ish deals and just more of depth pieces. What do you make of the ideology that the Saints usually go for when it comes to approaching free agency for the most part?
Yeah, it seems pretty interesting because I feel like here recently it's kind of been that's what they do for the most part, but then they tend to want to land maybe like one splash signing or something like that, right? They brought in Tyrann Mathieu. This year, of course, they land Chase Young, which I don't think is an addition to be completely excited about, or I don't want to say completely excited, but like blindly excited about just yet, because we got to see how he fits in, what his role is, the neck procedure, all those other things. But I like the way that they've kind of been going about this, is that they fill out their needs, make sure that they get guys that are going to be able to come in and maybe add something that they didn't have before, or at least make up for the attrition that they saw in terms of the departures that they saw throughout the offseason. Bring in maybe one splash signing and then look to see what you're able to find after the draft. And what we're seeing more and more of in today's NFL is that a lot of these veterans are waiting to see what teams do in the NFL draft before they end up signing on with a team. They want to make sure that there's a role available to them, as opposed to signing and then having the role that they thought they were going to have get challenged by a young guy that they just got, that the team just selected in the first round or something like that. And so I think that there's still more on the way when it comes to New Orleans. They're usually pretty active late in free agency. We mentioned Tyrann Mathieu. He was a late post-draft add, Jarvis Landry years ago, and others. And so I expect that they'll continue to be active there. But I'm a fan of the approach that they took this year. I'm also a fan of the way that they dealt with their own contracts, restructuring contracts that made sense, extending contracts in ways that maybe a restructure didn't make sense, and then holding on to 3 or 4 contracts they haven't even touched yet, so that they have the option post the draft and in free agency to maybe make those moves, or if nothing else, let them play on that contract and not kick any more cash down the road. So I think all around it's been a necessary approach. It hasn't been an exciting approach, but it's been a necessary approach in terms of what this team needed.
Yeah, and usually when you look at the fan base and fans in general, they're always looking for like a splash deal that seems really exciting that you can really hang your hat on when it comes to, well, this is the guy that we got in free agency. I know right now it's more of Chase Young than anything else. And you're like, okay, that's kind of exciting because it's a former number 2 overall pick. But do you think that it's overblown in that sense that you always have to go get like 2 to 3 really big name guys to make it seem like you won in free agency and maybe you got better?
I think if your goal is to win in free agency, then you've lost. That's really the way that I look at it, is that yes, in order for you to win free agency, you probably need to go out there and make some of those big splash signings. And then, NFL media talks about you for a week and then you don't exist again until the draft. And then, everybody kind of goes back to square one. Right. And so I do think that if your goal is to win free agency, then yeah, you do need to make those signings. But I also think that the goal of winning free agency is pretty short-sighted, and that's why you actually see a lot more NFL teams take the approach that the New Orleans Saints did, as opposed to the NFL teams that go out there and spend big money. Oftentimes the teams that go out there spend big money and become those off-season champions, it doesn't usually tend to work out come the regular season. Now, obviously there's exceptions to that, but you're being the exception, not the norm in those cases. And so for the Saints, I think for them, it was more about what are the things that they needed to, what are the things that they needed to do to kind of retool, start their, I don't want to call it a rebuild, but start to kind of bring in a new influx of talent, young talent we've seen be a big emphasis over the course of free agency as well. And then that should allow them to be able to look at their opportunities to win in the regular season as opposed to being concerned about winning in free agency.
And then moving on to the draft, Ross. I know it's coming up in a week, and there's been a lot of talk about how it needs to be an offensive tackle. Where, of course, going back again, everyone wants like a big splash. Go get a wide receiver. When are we going to get a quarterback? I know it's tough with what's happened with Derek Carr now and that contract, but as you've looked at, and you had posted it on your X account, guys that are going within that range of between 12 and 17 that you could see available for the Saints at this point, what we've seen throughout the offseason, who do you think is maybe the favorite for the Saints to take at 14 if they don't trade up?
Yeah, I think it's Penn State offensive tackle Olu Fashanu is probably the one that's kind of the biggest name that's consistently mocked to New Orleans. But I will say that guys like Talise Fuaga out of Oregon State and Troy Fautanu out of Washington are probably the guys that maybe make the most sense. Look,
Mm-hmm.
Olu Fashanu is the guy that's going to be that's expected to be a perennial All-Pro in the NFL. Teams like the New York Jets who pick at 10 and the Las Vegas Raiders who, for instance, who pick at 13, maybe even the Denver Broncos who pick at 12. Those are all potential landing spots for offensive linemen. And so a guy like Olu Fashanu could potentially come off the board there. But it's the interesting thing is, what does this all mean for the New Orleans Saints and Trevor Penning when you draft the pure left tackle?
Yeah.
Whereas with guys like Fuaga and Fautanu, they can play left tackle, but they can also play right tackle in Fuaga and Fautanu's case. And in Fautanu's case, he can play inside at guard as well. And so maybe there's something about grabbing the guy at 14 that's going to change the way that you call plays, which both of those offensive linemen have the ability to do, that are hyper athletic, that fit into your zone run scheme that you're bringing in and trying to kind of deploy here in
Mm-hmm.
2024. And then therefore you have the versatility to be able to maximize who your best starting five are. Because what if Trevor Penning comes out, balls out, plays really well in the new system all throughout training camp? You burned a first round pick on Olu Fashanu. What do you do at left
Yeah.
tackle when it comes to that? Or do you try to move Olu Fashanu in haste over to the right side if Ryan Ramchik's not ready to go, as opposed to one of these other two guys that has experience playing at right tackle? So I think there's arguments that can be made for all three. But look, when you get an opportunity to get a franchise cornerstone at one of the most important positions on the field, it's really, really hard to say no to that. And especially when you can get a guy like Olu Fashanu, who's 21 years old and has everything ahead of him in terms of continuing to develop while also still being the guy that's already considered a perennial All-Pro coming into the NFL. There's a lot of arguments to be made in favor of that. So I think that's why Fashion is kind of the favorite. But I think really like I play kind of the rule of the three Fs between
Yep.
Fashanu, Fautanu, and Fuaga of just making sure you land one of those three guys at 14 and you can walk away a winner.
And it feels like for me, Fashanu has always been the odd man out because I feel like Talise is overall a better tackle. Whereas with Fatanu, you had brought it up, he can have the versatility of being on either left or right tackle, but then he can also move to the guard position.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really curious because it feels like with the Saints and what Mickey Loomis has talked about, it seems like they still want Trevor Penning to still work out at tackle. And I know we brought it up before of him moving to guard because of how much of a mauler he is, and you could just always have him be a pulling guard. But with Fatanu, does it feel like that makes more sense because of his versatility in case you want to plug and play like you had seen before with Andrews Pete?
Yeah, I'm really, really into the idea of a Faltano in New Orleans because he's sub 6'4", sure, but he's got the 34.5-inch arms, so he can play left tackle. You can move him out to right tackle. You could have him at left guard, which right now doesn't have an answer for New Orleans unless you intend for that to again be James Hurst. But for New Orleans, like if you can get a younger guy there and a guy like Faltano, who, like I mentioned before, changes the way that you call plays because of his footwork, because of his aggressiveness, because of his athleticism, all those things. I think if you have that option, you take that option. And then if you need him at right tackle, if you need him at left tackle, he's ready for you there too. So he's a really interesting one. And so I always jog between him and Fashanu as kind of the 1A, 1B almost, one and
Mhm.
two if you want to, or your one and your A even. That either one of those would be winning selections for the New Orleans Saints. And I think the big thing that you highlight there is absolutely right. They want Trevor Penning to work out at left tackle. So do you get the guy that purely works at left tackle, or do you prepare yourself for Trevor Penning to be the guy at left tackle, and then where you can move one of those other guys elsewhere? So I think that's one of the things that makes a lot of logical sense. We'll see which way the Saints go with it. But look, Penning's got everything that he needs here with this new system to be able to take a lot of steps forward. It's a run heavy system. It's a system that wants you to move as an offensive lineman. It's a system that really works with your athleticism. And then it's also going to be a system that wants to get the ball out of the hands of the quarterback very quickly. So he doesn't have to hold up in pass protection very long. He can build confidence over the course of all that. The idea of moving him into guard is interesting, but I don't think it's going to be successful. He's never played it in
Yeah.
his entire life. I don't know where you're going to see it from. And so if you get the opportunity to still utilize him at tackle, I think that's still the best case scenario for New Orleans.
Yeah, and I feel like it almost feels like as we've gone along, Fuaga almost feels like he's the odd man out. However,
Mhm.
whenever I kind of look at picks, not just for the Saints, but when I'm doing these mock drafts for all the teams in the first round, not only do I look at the need and look at the contracts and who they signed so far in free agency, but I also look at the history of where they go in the early rounds, or even if they're looking at a specific position, what school do they usually go to? And I haven't seen a lot of picks from the Saints going to either Penn State or from Washington. I know that
Mhm.
Washington's had a lot more recent success, but they've had quite a few picks in the first round and at least early on from Oregon State. I know most notably you go back to Brandon Cooks back in
Yep.
2014. So it's like, do you kind of go back to that well of going to a school that you're more familiar with?
You can. It depends though. Like, what has Penn State done differently now in their offensive scheme that now matches your new offensive scheme? And how is it different from what you've done over the course of the past 16, 17 years? And does that make different collegiate systems like Washington's, for instance, who run something very similar to what the New Orleans, a collegiate version of what the New Orleans Saints are going to want to do here in 2024? Does that make that more appealing? Does the idea that the Saints went with the raw pass protector a couple years ago for left tackle and went with the guy that was a little bit more set in terms of a run protector in Trevor Penning, and then now they have the opportunity to go with a guy who's pristine as a pass protector? Does that end up factoring in more? So I think there's a lot more than just sort of like the emblem on the helmet kind of a situation. It's what
Right.
is those teams running? How does that change? How has that changed as of late? And then how does that now change based upon how your offensive system has changed and all that? So I think there's enough value in just looking at the talent and how the talent fits and what they have played, as opposed to simply what school they've been at. What are the schemes? What are the systems? And how do those overlap? And sometimes you get, look, those long running systems like Ohio State has a way that they play football. To an extent, Penn State has a way that they play football, right?
Mhm.
And it's not throwing the football. And so how does that end up impacting the way that you look at your offense versus a Penn State offense? So I think that it's something that does factor in, but it won't be specifically about the name of the school. I think it'll be more specifically about what type of scheme that offense is
Yeah.
running and how you feel that player can translate from that scheme to your scheme.
Yeah, that's totally fair because, of course, whenever you bring in a new coach, you may be bringing a totally new scheme, and usually that's
Right.
how it goes because the previous scheme obviously wasn't working. Let's try something new. When it comes to that 14th overall pick, we know that the Saints they haven't traded down in a while, so I'm not even going to ask about that because it's been so long. I almost don't even treat that as a possibility. But depending on how those first 8, 9, 10 picks go, can you see the Saints trading up for a specific guy depending on what kind of runs there are?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, this team wants to be aggressive. They have their guy that they want to select in the first round. They could potentially move to go and get that guy, and we've seen them do that. Now, last year they played it, nice and easy with Brian Brzee, and that's who they were targeting, and that's who they got, and it all worked out. But maybe this year, if let's say Olu Fashanu is the guy that they really, really want, maybe they have to get ahead of the New York Jets in order to make that happen. The Chicago Bears picked for a second time within the top 10, 1 and 9. Maybe they're a potential trade back candidate. Could you potentially see the Las Vegas Raiders be a threat for Olu Fashanu, who I think might be a little bit more in on JC Latham out of Alabama, if I'm being honest? He's kind of a
Yeah.
better fit for what it is that they're looking for. And what their style of offensive line is. And so, but let's say that maybe there's something that goes on there and there's a chance that the Raiders could look to take Fashanu and the New Orleans Saints really want him. Could they call up their old buddy, old pal, old friends over in Denver and say, hey, what can we do to get up to 12, and get
Yeah.
ahead of the Raiders? So I could see that being the case, specifically if Olu Fashanu is the target, because I feel like he's the one that's got the greatest opportunity to maybe go within that 10 to 13 range, maybe even 9 to 13 range. But I think that because you have these really, really solid tackle options, 3 deep that could potentially make it down to 14. There's a chance that at least 4 quarterbacks are going in the top 10. There's a chance that 3 wide receivers are going. At least 1 defensive player is going. That gets you to 8 selections already right there.
Yeah.
And we probably expect 2 corners to maybe even go off the board before the Saints get there. So it's already 10. So the likelihood of one of those 3 tackles making it through 4 picks is certainly possible, right? So I
Yeah.
think that there's a chance there that you're probably pretty comfortable staying where you are.
And say you stay at 14, but we've got the tackles going, or there's a guy that everyone's been looking at, Brock Bowers, is still available at 14. I feel like that's an option because he can go between 10 and 17. Do you think that if he is available, that the Saints go away from their norm of taking offensive tackles, edge rushers, defensive linemen in general, secondary players, and wide
Yeah.
receivers, and even running backs? Do they go for a tight end that's not necessarily a premium type of position compared to other more impactful positions like we had mentioned?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I have 2 specific reasons why. The first of which is that tight ends take a long time to translate to the NFL, and even when they translate to the NFL immediately, they don't typically help you win games. Look at Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts came in and had one of the most successful rookie seasons at tight end, and what did that do for the Falcons? Nothing, right? And then even when Travis Kelce had his big season, as a rookie, how much did that really move the needle for Kansas City versus what they would have been even without him, or a mid-level tight end in the position? Like, those are arguments that teams are going to have just because of how the value of that position looks. And so I think that's one thing, is that it takes way too long for a tight end to transition for you to be willing to burn a first round pick when you have a lot of needs on your team. And then that leads me to the second point. You got a lot of needs on this team. Just to be upfront and frank and like as blatant as I can be about it, the Saints are not a good enough team to take a luxury pick at 14. They're just simply not. They have a lot of needs, and there's a lot of players that can address those needs. Even if they decided that, a falling defensive end, like let's say Dallas Turner falls for whatever reason, it
Mhm.
wouldn't take much. I mean, it would just take the Atlanta Falcons effectively taking a different defensive end at 8, right? Do they really
Mhm.
like Dallas Turner, or are they, Leatu Latu guys over there? We'll see. There's a lot of LA connection over there. We'll see what happens. And so, does a Dallas Turner fall far enough and then get past the Chicago Bears at 9 as well, because they want to add a wide receiver for Caleb Williams? And then does Dallas Turner make you change your mind at 14? I think that there's real opportunities for you to be able to adjust based upon all that happening, but I don't think that tight end should move the needle for you, because I don't think Brock Bowers is going to be the best player on the board at 14 if he is on the board.
And looking at the Saints beyond 14, I know you had brought it up in your latest edition of Locked On Saints. You were going to try and see if you could double dip into your Locked On
Mhm.
mock draft when it comes to you and your other colleagues. Do you think that that's a real possibility for the Saints to be able to get into the 20s or even early 30s at the end of the first round? That way they do have 2 first round picks?
I'll say it's probably way more possible for me in a mock draft situation than it is for them in a real draft situation, but it's certainly doable. I mean, with them selecting at 45, it just depends upon the pieces that they're willing to move on from and things like that. Because you're probably talking about obviously moving on from 45 in the second round, and then maybe next year's second, and you might have to throw a player in there. But if it's all worth it, then it could make sense. And so if you can get up to let's say the end of the draft, whether it's or in the first round, if it's 28 through 32, somewhere in there, what that does, that allows you to maybe get another trench player on either side of the football, maybe a wide receiver that you want to have a 5th-year option on. This team wants to be able to kind of get right with its salary cap. Now, their version of get right with the salary cap is different than every other team's version of get right with the salary
No
cap. There's
doubt.
no doubt about that. But getting cost controlled star players makes sense, especially for the first 4 years, and then a 5th-year option where you're cost controlled again. and have the option to be able to restructure a fifth-year option on a player that you're giving a second contract to anyway, more than likely. If you're picking up the fifth-year option, there's a real opportunity for a team to be able to do that. And so I think that it's something that absolutely makes sense there, but I don't know if they would go about it, but there's value in doing it just based on getting that cost-controlled aspect of that player.
And then looking at day two, the Saints only have one pick in day two, and it's in the second round pick. It's in the second round, number 45
Mm-hmm.
overall. No third round picks, however. There's plenty of receivers in this draft. However, I already look at the young receiving room that they have. They took Chris Olave. They ended up getting a diamond in the rough in Rashid Shaheed, so that really worked out for them. And then
Mm-hmm.
they even took A.T. Perry late in the draft last year, which I had him as a third, fourth round guy. He ended up
Many of us
getting
did.
taken in the sixth, which
Mm-hmm.
was an absolute win for me because I was always a big fan of him at Wake Forest. With
Mm-hmm.
so many young guys, and then you get Cedric Wilson to be a veteran presence, do
Mm-hmm.
you think that they still try and take another receiver early on, somewhat in the draft, in the middle rounds? Or do you think that they look at it more of just let's just take a flyer on another sixth or seventh round guy, or just go get more UDFAs in that
Yeah, I
position?
think I think there's value in making a move for another wide receiver in this year's draft. It's such a talented crop, and there's guys that are out there that are of a mold, archetype, prototype, however it is that you want to look at it, that the New Orleans Saints don't have on their roster. Like right now, they don't really have a guy that you can throw a 7 yard slant to that's going to turn it into a 63-yard touchdown. They don't really have that guy. Like Rashid Shaheed could be that guy, but it relies on finesse a lot. You have to get him in space. You got to be able to do all those other things. And also, he's got other roles and responsibilities that I think should be added. Getting him a little bit more involved in the run game, deploying him out of the backfield, like doing a lot of fun stuff with him. But who's that guy that can line up in the slot, take a, um, take a slant, and house it and all those other things. Like there's real opportunity to be able to do that with a guy like Malachi Corley, for instance, out of Western Kentucky University, which maybe, like we could talk about trading back from 45, but I know we don't really entertain the idea of trade backs, and I don't blame us.
Not with this
But
team.
yeah, but like they got 4 5th-round selections, right? They're not using all those. They're not going to sit on their hands for the third and fourth rounds. At least I'd be surprised if they did. And if they did, it's because
Right.
no one's picking up the phone. They're busy. And so you could do that. You could leverage some of your next year draft capital and then be able to move up. Malachi Corley is a guy that's expected to go in the 60 to 80 range. And so it wouldn't be hard to get up to that. Seattle Seahawks at 81. That's a team that you've had dealings with before. Jeff Snyder and Mickey Loomis are good friends. The value is there to leverage a couple of 5th-round picks and a future third, and then move up to the third round of this year. Like there's ways to do that. The other guy that I really like that you could actually take at 45 is Xavier Legette, out of University of South Carolina. I think he is better with the ball in his hands right now than Deebo Samuel was coming out of South Carolina. Now, Deebo Samuel turned into something completely different over the course of his time with San Francisco, and they did a really good job with that. But Xavier Legette, I think, is better with the ball in his hands right now as a draft prospect as Deebo Samuel was as a draft prospect first coming into the NFL. So can you take advantage of that in an offense that's going to be run by a guy that just spent a year working with Deebo Samuel, who probably says, you know what, I'd really like a Deebo Samuel in this roster, or at least somebody who can hold that role. And so both of those guys, I think, check those boxes.
And you had brought up the fact that the Saints have a handful of fifth round picks. And at that point, you might as well trade a couple of them and then try to get back into the third round because we know that the Saints usually do that. Usually they have a couple of compensatory picks in the third round, so you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to worry about that. But the fact that you have so many late round picks, it feels like that's the perfect opportunity. If you really like a guy in the second or third round, you trade those later picks to go get a guy that you really like and you want to take a shot on.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like there's a real opportunity for you to be able to do that. And of course, with this year being the draft class that it is, there's kind of this drop off after the top 100 or so, like 100 plus, like 110 or so
Mhm.
players. And then the value kind of comes back later on around 170, 175, both of which are selections that the Saints currently have in the fifth round. And so there's an opportunity at 150, 168, 170, 175 to just be able to maybe package some of those to get into the top 100 if you can, to be able to take advantage of what is a stronger top 100 class than a bottom 150 plus class. And so there's a real opportunity to be able to do that, and I don't think that that's something that the Saints um should rule out, nor do I think it's anything that they would rule out. We know they like to be aggressive and go and get their guys, and so I think that it would make perfect sense in this year's draft.
And then looking at a couple of the top 30 visits that the Saints have made, one of them is Marshawn Lloyd. I wanted to get your thoughts on him out of
Mhm.
USC because there's been quite a few guys, and I know that they took Kendre Miller last year, but
Hmm.
with the new scheme, does it really fit what Kendre wants to do? I know you could do more outside stretch runs with Kamara. That way he gets more in space, and then you have Jamal doing the dirty work inside with power runs. But if you're moving on from Kendre, maybe he just becomes the odd man out. Is Marshawn Lloyd maybe a potential pick that they do, maybe with a third round pick that they end up trading up for or later in the draft?
Yeah, I would say that if they did go up and draft Marshawn Lloyd, who, by the way, I think is fantastic. He's like one of those one cut, stick your foot in the dirt, turn. Latavius, like a young Latavius Murray, right? He
Yeah,
just
love
gets
Latavius.
upfield. Yeah, and he's got that, but he's got the Mark Ingram build at 5'8", 220 plus, everything like that. So really good gap run scheme guy, which is a little bit more hat on hat. My responsibility is to block you because you're lined up in front of me, kind of a thing.
Right.
And he's got a lot of experience doing that at USC, but he's also really elusive, can run through tackles, all those other things. And he's got good speed too, running in kind of that 4.48, 4.46 area. So the way that I would look at it is that if the Saints were to make that move, I think what you're doing is that you've got this kind of Jamal Williams, Alvin Kamara tandem for 2024, but what's the future of those players beyond 2024, beyond 2025? And then you have a very, very young Kendre Miller, who was only 20 years old when they drafted him.
Yeah.
And then a Marshawn Lloyd, who's also fairly young. I think he's like in the 23, if I remember, range. So that those guys can kind of just boop, pop right into, those two roles and everything. And so then you still have your zone runner in Kendre Miller and your man runner in Marshawn Lloyd, who can also each do each other's jobs. And that's what made Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram, Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray so hard to defend, is that they just simply could do it. They were asked to run zone, they were asked to run man, they could do it, but there was not versatility, I'm sorry. There was dynamics between how they were utilized, and that has kind of gone away from this offense here over the course of the past couple of years. They haven't done much service to their running backs over the course of the past few years. And so that's set to change this year in 2024. And so I think if you see a Marshawn Lloyd, one, it's not necessarily that Kendre Miller becomes an odd man out. It's just that Kendre Miller and Marshawn Lloyd get partnered for what they can be together, maybe moving forward. That's kind of the way I would look at it.
Almost like a transition period where we move on from
Yeah,
Jamal, we move on from Alvin, but now we got the next duo, kind of like what we had with Alvin and Mark back in
right.
2017, 2018. You
Yeah,
were right about or Marshawn being 23 years old, so
nailed
right on with that one. Is
it.
are there a couple of guys in the later rounds that you're looking at that the Saints are looking at or you think could be Saints guys? Because I know that a lot of us are worried about the first, maybe the second, or even there are those few that worry about the third round if the Saints can get into it. But for day three, guys, are there any of them that you're looking out for that the Saints should take, or maybe you think have a high chance of taking?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think they should absolutely be interested in Tyrone Tracy, the running back out of Purdue. So if they didn't go the Marshawn Lloyd route, one way to go would be with Tyrone Tracy. He's about 6 foot, 200 plus, good speed on him. He's actually a former wide receiver. First two collegiate years that he played at Iowa, he was a wide receiver. Then he transitioned over to running back over the course of the past couple of years for Purdue, and can actually run. Like, not a situation where they just put him back there so he could run around outside of the backfield or anything like that. He's actually a good running back, good vision, good anticipation, good job attacking, the gaps when they're there, all those other things. So he just does a great job. And he's another one of those guys, along with like Malachi Corley and Xavier Legette, who can maybe fill I don't want to say Debo Samuel talent, but Debo Samuel role. Like if you took the Samuel and turned it into a position, he could play the Samuel. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so like he's one of those guys that's probably a fifth round selection in that area. I would also say Trey Taylor is a big time deep sleeper for me. He's the Jim Thorpe Award winner, but we're talking about him as a sixth or seventh round selection because he's coming out of Air Force, but has the experience of playing out wide in the slot, playing at safety down in the box, and playing at safety deep. He's just kind of PJ Williams-ish, right? And we know how much the Saints loved having that versatile piece, and they might still be looking for somebody to compete at safety next to Tyrann Mathieu. Gave up one touchdown last year, but had three interceptions last season as well. So he's got a little bit of a ball hawking mentality and a draft that severely lacks ball hawking ability there.
Mhm.
So Trey Taylor's another one that I really, really like later on in the draft too.
And then not only are you the guy for the Locked On Saints podcast, but you also do Locked On NFL. And I'm
Mhm.
kind of curious when it comes to the betting line, we don't have to worry about betting. We don't have to worry about getting in trouble because we're not players on the field or coaches.
Right, right.
But the line
Yeah,
for the most part
we
when
won't be banished from the NFL today, which is
right or whatever
wild.
league we would be playing in for the most part. But when it comes to the quarterbacks, it's kind of been a sense, and there's a betting line for the most part at 4.5 quarterbacks in the first round. Do you
Yeah.
think that there's going to be under 4.5, or do you think that there's going to be 5 or 6 quarterbacks end up getting taken in the first?
I think the over is really, really possible, man. I really do. Because I think you might see five in the first, let's call it in the first six, right? The Giants pick at six. So let's call it that.
Hmm.
Or four, sorry, four first six. And then I think that fifth one could be, we were talking about the Saints potentially trading up to the bottom of the first round. We saw the Baltimore Ravens do this years ago with Lamar Jackson, where they traded into, I think it was either the 31st or the last pick of the
The last
draft
pick.
of the first round. Yeah, it was 32. Um, to draft Lamar Jackson. The Baltimore Ravens did that because they wanted the fifth-year option on the quarterback. So that's the value of trading into the first round. And so there's a real opportunity for a team like the New York Giants or a team like the Las Vegas Raiders who are still looking for their quarterback. And I know that the Giants have Daniel Jones, but that GM, that head coach did not draft Daniel Jones. They're going to move on from Daniel Jones as soon as they possibly can, I imagine. And so going and getting a Bo Nix or getting a Michael Penix to help them do that, the Las Vegas Raiders simply have no quarterback. And so being able to find a guy like Bo Nix or Michael Penix and getting that fifth-year option on them makes sense. So one of those two teams trading up, where with the exception of the Chiefs, there's no real division rivals toward the end of the draft there. There's a real opportunity for them to be able to move up. And so I think that that's where I would see maybe that fifth quarterback go in the first round if that were to happen. I don't think you take Michael Penix at 13. I don't think you take Bo Nix at 12 if you're the Denver Broncos, which is another team that could potentially try to move and then get another quarterback too. Um, so yeah, I could see five. I really realistically could see five, but I would be shocked if we don't see six in the first 40 picks, maybe
Hmm.
40, 45 picks. Like I'd be very shocked if we don't see six with Bo Nix and Michael Penix potentially going off the board a little bit later.
He is the host of the Locked On Saints podcast. He does a litany of other things. I could bring them all up, but we'd run out of time on this Zoom call. Ross, appreciate you coming on. You're always generous with your time, and I can only keep you for so long.
Real pleasure, my dude. Thank you so much for having me on, man. Always a pleasure.
Awesome. And that was Ross Jackson, the host of the Locked On Saints podcast. Hope you liked all that talk about the Saints and what's going to go on in the draft and what's happened so far in free agency. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, ESPN Southwest And don't forget to turn on that notification bell to get notified anytime we upload any one of our podcasts, not just this one. Matt Miguez has plenty of others. Dawson Iserloh's got a couple as well. But until then, we'll talk to you next week, looking at more of an NFL broad perspective with another locked on guy. You'll have to stay tuned till then. Talk to you next time.